It was just another ordinary day for Jason, or so he thought. He had been stuck in a dead-end job for the past few months, barely scraping by, when he received the mysterious letter. No return address, no signature, just his name in neat black ink on the front. It was an invitation, but Jason had no idea who would be sending him something like this. He hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of him. He tore open the envelope and found a single piece of paper inside, with a message that would change everything. "Come alone. It's time to make things right." The words echoed in his mind, leaving him more confused than ever. Make things right? Jason didn't even know what that meant. He had always been the type of person to avoid trouble, to steer clear of anything that might rock the boat. But the strange urgency in the letter was enough to pull him in. What could be so important that someone would go through the effort of sending this cryptic message? Jason had no idea, but he felt something stirring deep inside, a mix of fear and excitement that made it impossible to ignore. So, he made his decision. He packed his things, called in sick, and set off to the location written at the bottom of the letter. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had been abandoned for years. The streets were eerily quiet as he drove through, his headlights cutting through the darkness. As he pulled into the cracked parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Jason was no stranger to uncertainty, but this felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stepped out of the car. The warehouse loomed in front of him, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight in an almost haunting way. There was no sign of anyone else, no other cars, no lights on inside, just silence, stretching out like a blanket of darkness. He hesitated again, but the letter in his hand seemed to pull him forward. Jason approached the entrance, his footsteps echoing off the walls of the empty parking lot. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside, there were tables and chairs scattered about, but no sign of life. At least, not at first. It was as though the place had been frozen in time, a forgotten memory. Suddenly, a low voice came from the shadows, sending a chill down his spine. "You came." Jason froze. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. And then, slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, standing in front of him. The person was wearing a mask, hiding their face, but Jason knew instantly this wasn't a stranger. The masked figure stepped closer, their voice cold and calculated. "Do you want to know the truth?" Jason's heart raced, and as the figure reached out to hand him something, an object wrapped in black cloth, he couldn't help but feel like he was about to step into a nightmare. And he hadn't even realized it yet. The truth. What was the truth? And more importantly, was he ready to face it? Before he could speak, the warehouse door slammed shut behind him. The room plunged into darkness. "Don't scream," the figure whispered. "You've already made your choice." And then, nothing. Jason's pulse hammered in his ears as the darkness enveloped him. His eyes frantically searched for any hint of light, but the shadows seemed to swallow everything. He could feel his breathing grow shallow, each exhale thick with the tension of the unknown. The sound of his own heartbeat was deafening in the silence. But then there was another noise, soft at first, like a whisper, then louder, a slow, deliberate shuffle, as though someone or something was moving toward him. His mind raced. He had to get out. He had no idea what was going on, but the sense of danger was palpable. Jason's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the floor beneath him had turned to cement. He tried to steady his breathing, to force some kind of rational thought. But the more he tried to focus, the more the walls of the warehouse seemed to close in on him. He wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was in here with him had control. Then, through the blackness, he saw it. A flicker of light. At first, it was so faint he thought he had imagined it. But there it was again, growing stronger with each passing second. The masked figure appeared once more, but this time, they were closer, much closer, standing just a few feet away from him. Their presence was almost suffocating, and Jason felt an overwhelming need to understand who they were, but his voice wouldn't cooperate. "Why am I here?" Jason finally managed, his voice strained with fear. "Who are you?" The figure said nothing. Instead, they reached out, pushing the wrapped object closer to Jason, forcing him to take it. He hesitated for a moment, looking down at the black cloth that now rested in his hands, before reluctantly unwrapping it. Inside, there was a small, old-fashioned key. Nothing more, nothing less. The metal was cold, its surface worn down from years of use, yet it somehow felt heavy, like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. The figure didn't speak again, but Jason could feel their eyes on him, waiting, watching. He glanced around, but the warehouse was as silent as it had been when he first entered. Nothing moved, and yet everything seemed to be watching him, as though the very building itself was alive. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the key, but nothing came to him. The letter, the masked figure, the sudden disappearance of his own sense of safety, all of it felt like a trap, but he couldn't yet figure out how to escape it. He glanced back at the figure, hoping for some sort of explanation, but all he received was that same cold stare, their face hidden beneath the mask. The air seemed thicker now, as though every breath he took was somehow more difficult than the last. He shifted on his feet, the cold concrete beneath him now feeling more like ice, and the dread in his stomach began to grow. What was he supposed to do with this key? And why had the figure handed it to him without a word? Was there some hidden door, some secret they wanted him to find? Jason's mind flashed back to his ordinary life before this, his job, his apartment, his lackluster existence. He had always wanted something more, but not like this. This wasn't the adventure he'd imagined. This wasn't a movie or a fantasy. This was real, and real things weren't kind to people like him. A sudden thought hit him. What if he wasn't meant to understand yet? What if the answers were hidden, waiting for him to make the next move, to unlock something that would lead him deeper into whatever nightmare this was? "Why are you doing this?" Jason whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering the question, and then, with deliberate slowness, they pointed to the far end of the warehouse, toward a rusted door barely visible in the dark. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He knew what he had to do, but as he took a step forward, a voice, low, unfamiliar, whispered in the back of his mind, "The truth isn't what you think. And once you open that door, there's no going back." Jason froze, his hand tightening around the key in his pocket. He didn't know who had spoken, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. The air seemed to thicken once more, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Was it the figure, or something else? Jason had no choice but to continue, the pull of the unknown stronger than his fear. But with every step toward that door, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was about to uncover something deep, something dark. But would it be worth the price he'd have to pay? Jason's heart was racing now, each beat echoing in his chest as he moved closer to the rusted door. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, making every inch of the warehouse feel alive with menace. His hand trembled as it hovered over the key in his pocket, the weight of it almost unbearable. Was this really the next step? Was this key the answer to everything? Or was it just another part of the puzzle designed to trap him further in a web of darkness he couldn't escape? The masked figure stood still, observing him with that chilling, silent gaze. Jason tried to steady his breath, forcing himself to move forward. The whispers were louder now, and he could feel them crawling beneath his skin, pushing him toward that door. He reached the base of it and stopped, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the knob. For a moment, he hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if walking through this door would lead to something far worse than he could imagine? He thought back to the letter, the one that had started all of this. "You'll find the truth when you're ready for it," it had said. But was he ready? Was anyone ever really ready for the truth? With a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lock. There was a soft click, and the door creaked open just enough for him to slip through. As he stepped inside, the air shifted. It felt colder, heavier, and he immediately felt the weight of something watching him. His eyes darted around, but the darkness inside was thick, thicker than the rest of the warehouse had been. He strained to make out shapes, but it was as though the shadows themselves were alive, swirling and shifting around him. Then a sound, a low, guttural growl, came from the back of the room. Jason's body froze, his every instinct telling him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The growl grew louder, and then something shifted in the corner. Jason's eyes snapped toward it, and he saw a figure. No, multiple figures, moving through the shadows. They weren't human, at least not entirely. Their forms were distorted, like grotesque imitations of people, their faces twisted in ways that made Jason's stomach churn. He backed away, his breath quickening. Whatever these things were, they weren't supposed to be here. They were part of the mystery, part of whatever had been set in motion when he first received that letter. Jason's mind raced, trying to piece things together, but it was all slipping through his fingers like sand. He had come this far, and now it seemed like there was no turning back. One of the creatures in the shadows stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly. It didn't speak, but Jason could feel the intensity of its gaze. Slowly, it extended a hand toward him, the fingers long and clawed. His pulse thundered in his ears as he struggled to move, to fight or flee. But before he could react, another sound filled the room. A voice, soft and chilling, like ice running down his spine. "You shouldn't have come." Jason's mind screamed at him to leave, but his feet were still glued to the floor. He could feel the key burning in his pocket, as though it was somehow tied to this moment, to the creatures surrounding him. The letter had warned him, but he hadn't understood. He had come here searching for answers, for truth, but the price for those answers was becoming more and more apparent. The creatures seemed to grow closer, their presence suffocating, the air growing colder by the second. Behind him, the door slammed shut. Jason's pulse skyrocketed. There was no way out. The creature in the front stepped even closer, its eyes never leaving his. "You are the key," it whispered, and Jason could almost feel the weight of its words, like they were carving into his very soul. He didn't understand. What did it mean? He was the key. He had the actual key in his pocket, but this felt different. Something about this place, this moment, was making him feel like he was a part of something much bigger than himself. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the stillness, a loud mechanical grinding, from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. Jason snapped his head around, searching for the source. But before he could react, the creature closest to him reached out with its clawed hand, gripping his arm with unnatural strength. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, its voice now low and guttural, almost like it was mocking him. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and Jason's stomach lurched as the air grew thicker still. His mind screamed at him to escape, but there was nowhere to go. And then, as quickly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The creature let go of his arm, and the sound of grinding metal stopped. The room was silent again, but Jason could feel his pulse racing. The creatures were still there, standing in the shadows, but now they were waiting, watching him, just like the figure had done before. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a test. This wasn't just about the key. Whatever he had stumbled into, it was bigger than him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to find out just how deep it went. Suddenly, the figure from earlier appeared again in the doorway, its mask now reflecting a faint light. It said nothing, but the message was clear. The door behind him was now wide open, beckoning Jason to return. But when he turned back to face the creatures, they were gone. The shadows were empty. Jason was alone again. Or was he? The silence stretched on, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't in control anymore. Something was pulling the strings, something far darker than he had ever imagined. And just as his hand reached for the door, a voice whispered from the shadows, barely audible, "You've made your choice, Jason. There's no going back now." Jason's breath caught in his throat as the voice from the shadows echoed in his ears. "There's no going back now." The words spun in his mind like a cursed chant, digging into his skull. He stood frozen, the door in front of him now feeling like the doorway to an unknown fate. His hand trembled as it hovered over the handle, but something was pulling him back, something dark. He knew he wasn't alone. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him again. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like it took a lifetime. The ground beneath him groaned, as though the building itself was alive. The flickering light above cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and sway, growing longer, more menacing with each passing second. Jason tried to move, but found himself rooted to the spot. His legs felt like lead, his body unwilling to obey. It was as though something invisible was holding him back, making it impossible to escape. Then, the sound of distant footsteps echoed from deeper in the warehouse, slow and deliberate. His heart skipped a beat. Were they coming for him again? He turned but saw nothing. No figures, no shapes, just the creeping, swirling darkness. But the footsteps continued, getting closer, closer, like they were circling him. A sudden sharp screech from behind him made him jump. The metal door had begun to close on its own, inch by agonizing inch. Jason's pulse hammered in his chest, his mind racing with panic. The coldness around him seemed to intensify. The shadows seemed to grow, coiling tighter around his body like a noose. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and thunderous in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. But then the whisper came again, clear and chilling. "The key is what binds you." Jason spun toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it a warning, or was it a clue? He could feel the tension tightening in the room, the air growing denser, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to break free, but the door was closing fast, the gap narrowing with each passing second. He had to make a choice, and fast. Without thinking, he darted toward the shadows where the creatures had disappeared moments before. He moved quickly, desperately searching for any sign of them, any sign of what was happening. The ground beneath him was cold and uneven, the air growing staler with every step. The footsteps stopped, and in that eerie silence, Jason's mind began to unravel. What was this place? What did it want from him? Then he saw it, a glint of metal, almost hidden in the dark. A small rusted box lay half buried under a pile of old crates. It was so out of place, like it had been waiting for him. Jason's hand shot out toward it before he could think better of it. As his fingers wrapped around the cold metal, a surge of energy coursed through him. The room seemed to shift, the shadows swirling around him in a violent storm. The creatures appeared again, their twisted faces now visible in the gloom, their eyes glowing faintly. But they didn't move, didn't approach. They were waiting, watching, judging. Jason's pulse quickened. He could hear the soft metallic scrape of the door closing behind him. He had to act. Whatever was inside the box, it had to be the answer. Or was it? Was this just another trap? He snapped the box open with shaking hands, the rusted hinges protesting against the movement. Inside, nestled among fragments of paper and old brittle objects, was a single object, a small, delicate key. Its surface gleamed in the dim light, and Jason's heart skipped. This wasn't just any key. It was the same as the one he had in his pocket. His mind raced. How could this be? How could there be two? Before he could process it further, a low, guttural growl rumbled from behind him. Jason spun around, the key still in his hand. The creatures were closer now, almost within arm's reach. Their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The air was heavy, thick with their presence. Jason could feel the ground shaking beneath him, the building groaning under pressure, as though it was about to collapse. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the growl stopped. The creatures froze, their eyes locked on him. A cold chill washed over Jason, and he felt a deep, primal fear settle in his chest. The tension in the room was unbearable. It felt like something was building, something was about to snap. The door behind him was now completely closed, sealing him inside. There was no way out. His hands clenched around the two keys, the weight of them heavy in his grip. Was this the moment? Was this the choice he had to make? His mind screamed for an answer, but there was none. And then, with a sound that could only be described as a hiss, the creatures stepped back, their bodies rippling and shifting like shadows. The key in his hand began to vibrate, a low hum filling the room, growing louder and louder. Jason could feel it now, the pull. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. His eyes darted to the shadows again. There was no way out, not anymore. And as the ground beneath him trembled again, Jason realized, with horrifying clarity, that the key was the only way forward. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the hum of the key intensified, vibrating in his hand like a live wire. The creatures had retreated into the shadows, their glowing eyes locked on him with a sense of eerie anticipation. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him to make a move. The ground trembled again, the sound of cracking concrete vibrating through his feet. It was as if the building itself was alive, and whatever was inside the key was waking it up. Jason's mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. What was the key for? What did it unlock? He had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. He glanced at the other key, still tucked in his pocket, and for a moment, he considered putting them together. But something told him that would be a mistake, that whatever was coming next, he needed to be ready for it. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and Jason's breath fogged in the air. A cold, oppressive feeling settled over him like a blanket. The shadows seemed to stretch, curling around the corners of the room as though they were alive. Jason could feel them closing in on him. It was then that he heard the whisper again, low and guttural, reverberating through the darkness. "Use it, Jason." The voice came from all directions, and it was unmistakably human, yet not. His skin crawled as the words sank in. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing. His mind was playing tricks on him, he thought. He was losing grip on reality, but the pressure was mounting. The key in his hand was vibrating harder now, almost painfully so. There was no ignoring it. Then, from the far corner of the room, a figure stepped into the dim light. Jason's breath caught. It was a man, dressed in a dark suit, his features obscured by the shadows. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural, otherworldly light. Jason's first instinct was to run, but his body refused to move. He was trapped. The man spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you have control? You think you understand what's happening here?" His lips curled into a sinister smile. "You've already made a choice, Jason. The key doesn't just open doors, it opens paths, and you're standing at the crossroads now. But you won't have to choose alone." Jason's mind reeled. What was this man talking about? What paths? What choice? The creatures seemed to grow restless, their eyes shifting between Jason and the man, as if waiting for some kind of signal. Jason's grip on the key tightened. He could feel the pressure building, like a dam ready to burst. The man stepped closer, his movement unnervingly fluid, almost like he was gliding. "You see," he continued, "there's a reason you found that key, a reason you're here. You're not the first to be chosen, Jason, but you might be the last." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another key, identical to the one in Jason's hand. Jason's mind raced. Was this some kind of game? The man wasn't human, that much was clear. But what did he want with the key? Why did he want it so badly? He couldn't keep up with the whirlwind of thoughts spinning in his head, and the more he thought, the more lost he felt. Suddenly, the air shifted. The ground trembled harder, and the walls around him seemed to groan, as if the entire building was about to collapse. Jason could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This wasn't just about the key anymore. It wasn't just about escaping. This was bigger, much bigger. The man smiled again, his eyes glinting with a malicious gleam. "The key is a test, Jason, and you're the only one left who can pass it. But be careful. The choice you make now will determine everything, and you may not be able to undo it." Before Jason could respond, the creatures closed in, their eyes glowing brighter, their mouths opening wide, but they weren't moving toward him. They were looking at the man, waiting for his command. Jason could feel the tension in the air. Whatever was coming next, it was going to change everything. And then, without warning, the man dropped the second key into Jason's hand, his voice a mere whisper in the chaos. "Make your choice." The world seemed to stop. Time itself hung in the balance. Jason's mind was reeling, but there was no time left to think. The air felt charged, alive with anticipation. Whatever choice he made now, there would be no turning back. The second key felt heavier than the first. Jason's hand trembled as he gripped it, the strange vibrations growing stronger, almost like the key was alive. The creatures in the room were silent now, their eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. The man, too, had gone still, his gaze never leaving Jason's face. "Make your choice," the man repeated, his voice colder this time, carrying an edge of finality. Jason's mind raced. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. Everything he had known was collapsing, and there was no way to stop it. The choice before him wasn't just a simple decision. It was a decision that would shape the world around him, one way or another. The two keys in his hands felt like anchors, pulling him in opposite directions. One promised power, the other freedom. But in that moment, Jason knew there was more at stake than his own life. His breath caught in his throat as he made a split-second decision. Without thinking, he slammed both keys together, their edges meeting with a sharp, metallic click. A blinding flash of light erupted, engulfing the room in a searing blaze. Jason shielded his eyes, but it was no use. The light seemed to burn through his skin, his bones, his very soul. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. When Jason opened his eyes, the world had changed. The building that had once loomed dark and oppressive now stood bright, almost gleaming in the sunlight. The air felt fresher, the atmosphere lighter, as though something had been lifted from the earth itself. He was no longer alone. The creatures, once hostile and monstrous, were now human. Their eyes, though still glowing faintly, held no malice. Instead, they seemed almost curious, studying him as if they were waiting for him to speak. The man who had given him the keys stood before him, but he was different too. His dark suit was gone, replaced by simple, almost humble clothing. His once ghostly face was now warm, almost kind. "You did it," the man said, his voice filled with a strange pride. "You made the right choice." Jason looked around, bewildered. "But what happened? What did I do?" "You broke the cycle," the man explained. "For centuries, this world has been trapped in a loop, one where people like you are chosen to carry the keys, to play the game, but never to win. You're the first to ever truly pass the test." Jason's mind struggled to comprehend the enormity of what the man was saying. "I didn't know I was playing a game," he muttered, more to himself than to the man. "You weren't supposed to know," the man replied with a knowing smile. "That's the point. You were meant to follow the rules, obey the choices laid before you, and remain ignorant. But you broke free from it." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, a sense of unease creeping in. The world around him looked different, but not in the way he expected. There was something off, something unsettling beneath the surface. The creatures, though no longer monstrous, still watched him with those glowing eyes. And the man, was he truly who he said he was? Jason's doubts grew stronger with each passing moment. Then, in the distance, something shifted. A figure appeared, rising from the horizon. It was tall, looming, its outline obscured by the shifting light. As it drew closer, Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was him. The man in front of him, the one who had given him the keys, was now standing beside Jason. But this new figure, the one emerging from the light, was an older, darker version of him. The air thickened with a sudden, overwhelming realization. "You didn't just break the cycle, Jason," the man whispered. "You became part of it." The new figure, the older version of Jason, smiled darkly, his eyes gleaming with the same unnatural light the creatures had once possessed. "Welcome to the beginning of your new role." The keys weren't just a test, they were a transformation. Jason staggered back, his mind spinning. Had he been part of the game all along? Was this world, this reality, truly his? Was it all a trap? Before he could fully grasp the horror of the situation, the older version of him spoke again, his voice a chilling echo. "The real test begins now, Jason. You're no longer the player. You're the keeper." And in that moment, Jason realized the terrible truth. The world he thought he had freed was the one he would now be trapped in forever. The keys had not led him to salvation. They had led him to his place in an eternal cycle. The light flickered around him as the creatures, now fully human, began to kneel before him, waiting for his command. Jason's body froze, his pulse racing. The cycle had only just begun, and he was its new master. Jason stood there, frozen, surrounded by the hum of the twisted world he now ruled. The air felt thick with power. The creatures, now human, yet still tinged with that strange otherworldly glow, bowed to him in silence. It was as if the room had become a temple, and he was the high priest, though none of this felt right. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the weight of his new role seemed to crush him from all sides. The older version of him, the one who had emerged from the light, smiled again. The smile wasn't warm or comforting, but something far colder, more calculating. "You're not alone in this, Jason," he said softly, stepping closer. "You'll find that you are never truly alone. This cycle, this responsibility, it's yours now, and it's been waiting for you." Jason's throat tightened as he tried to process what was happening. He had broken free from one game, only to be thrust into another. But this time, there was no escape. The keys had not been a test of strength or wisdom. They were a test of choice, and Jason had chosen power, unknowingly. He had unwittingly accepted his place in the endless loop that bound this strange world together. "I didn't want this," Jason whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The older version of him stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with an almost sadistic joy. "It doesn't matter whether you wanted it or not. The choices have already been made. The world bends to your will now. You have the power to shape it or destroy it. It's all in your hands." Jason's mind was spinning. He wanted to fight, to run, to scream, but something deep inside him, something primal, told him that resistance was futile. He had stepped into the role, and now he had to play it. The creatures, his followers, were still kneeling, waiting for his command, but something in their eyes had changed. There was no fear, no malice, only a quiet, desperate hope. They weren't just waiting for orders, they were waiting for salvation. And Jason realized with a jolt that in some twisted way, they believed he could give it to them. "You have to understand," the older Jason continued, his voice soft now, almost tender. "This place isn't real. It's a reflection, a mirror of what could be, what might have been, if only the right choices had been made." Jason's thoughts raced. "So this is all fake? None of this matters?" The man shook his head. "No, it matters. It's just that, in the end, the world you thought you knew doesn't matter. The only thing that matters now is what you choose to do with your power. Will you be the savior or the tyrant? Will you break the cycle once and for all? Or will you feed it until it consumes you?" Jason swallowed hard, the weight of the question sinking in. He was standing at the crossroads of destiny, with no clear path ahead. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It was his to decide. The creatures, his followers, looked up at him, their eyes filled with silent anticipation. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, Jason felt a strange sense of clarity. He understood now that the choices he had made, whether consciously or not, had placed him in this moment, this impossible situation. But he also realized something else. He could still choose. He didn't have to be the master. He didn't have to let the cycle continue. The power that had been thrust upon him, the control over this world, it was his, yes. but so was the choice to destroy it. As the tension hung in the air, Jason raised his hand, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I won't let this cycle continue. I'll find a way to break it. For everyone." And with those words, something shifted. The light around him dimmed. The creatures began to stir, their faces slowly changing, softening. There was a long silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jason turned to face the older version of himself. "It ends now," he said with finality. The older Jason smiled, but there was no malice in it anymore. "Then let it end," he said, fading into the light. And as Jason stood alone in the now empty room, the weight of his decision settled over him. He had broken the cycle, yes, but in doing so, he had become part of a new one, a cycle of choices, consequences, and endless possibilities. What came next was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jason felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The world had changed, and so had he.